You weren't born in debt, but it didn't take long to start feeling like you owed something. Before you ever held a credit card, before your name was ever attached to a student loan or car payment or overdue bill, debt had already moved in, quietly, psychologically. It wasn't just a number, it was a story, a belief system, a contract written in invisible ink, signed in childhood, passed down by parents, teachers, media, and the soft hum of society, whispering, "You don't have enough. You'll need to borrow to be whole." Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. If you grew up watching money make people stressed, angry, scared, or ashamed, you were already in emotional debt. If you watched your parents argue over bills, silently skip luxuries, or fear unexpected expenses, you were being conditioned, not to be financially wise, but to associate survival with owing. So when you got older and the first buy now, pay later offer showed up, it didn't feel foreign. It felt familiar, normal, maybe even comforting. Here's the thing. Debt in its modern form isn't just about access. It's about inheritance. You inherit beliefs about money before you ever have your own. You inherit emotional postures, scarcity, guilt, fear of asking. You inherit behaviors, living paycheck to paycheck, avoiding financial conversations, seeing budgeting as punishment instead of clarity. And most importantly, you inherit powerlessness. That's the real starting point. Debt feels like a financial decision, but it functions like psychological training. Here's the paradox. The less money you grow up with, the more likely you are to be targeted by systems that profit from your future desperation. Think about that. Credit cards for broke college students, predatory loans in low-income neighborhoods, buy now, pay later schemes in communities where saving is a luxury. You're told debt is a tool, but they hand it to you like a weapon you're forced to turn on yourself. And the worst part? They wrap it in language that feels empowering. Build credit. Start your journey. No payments for 6 months. Translation? We'll let you feel free while we quietly own your future. What nobody tells you is that from the moment you take on that debt, you also take on a new identity, the debtor. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens subtly. You start organizing your calendar around payments. You start making decisions not based on what excites you, but what you can afford. You start thinking of every opportunity, every risk, every new beginning in terms of how much it would set you back. This is the invisible curriculum of debt. It trains you to think small, to play defense, to keep your dreams reasonable, to measure your self-worth in monthly minimums and interest rates. You start to believe that financial hope lives in the hands of your future, higher-earning self, who never quite arrives. And that's where the real mind trap begins. See, financial institutions don't just lend money, they lend identity frameworks. They offer you a psychological role to play, borrower, which implies a second role you don't consciously choose but start to embody anyway, lesser. Because let's be honest, when you owe, you feel smaller, more cautious, more anxious, more submissive. You might still walk into work or post online like everything is fine, but deep down, you feel like your life isn't really yours until the number hits 0. This is why people in debt often don't just feel poor. They feel behind, out of sync, like everyone else is building while they're patching holes. But here's what you need to know. Debt isn't shameful because of the number. It's shameful because of the narrative you were handed, that money equals virtue, that having less makes you irresponsible, that if you're struggling, it's because you messed up, not because the game was rigged. This narrative is so deeply embedded that even when you try to be financially responsible, you often recreate the very same scarcity that got you here. You try to budget your way out of a mindset built on lack. You try to out-discipline a belief system that says you'll never have enough. You try to pay your way back into self-worth. But the truth is, you were never just in debt to a bank. You were in debt to a system. One that profits off your silence. One that relies on your fear. One that thrives as long as you keep blaming yourself instead of asking better questions. So let's ask one now. What if debt wasn't a personal failure, but a cultural ritual? What if being in debt wasn't a reflection of your bad decisions, but a predictable outcome of growing up in a world where access is gated by borrowing, and borrowing reshapes how you see yourself? Let that sink in. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start to notice how early the hooks were planted, how the shame was inherited, how the hustle was romanticized, how the pressure to own came with terms that guaranteed you'd never really feel free. That's why this conversation isn't about money. It's about mindset, about the way you were taught to carry yourself in a world that sold you worth at interest. So if you've ever looked at your debt and thought, this isn't me, you're right, it's not. But if you never step back and trace how that mindset was installed, you'll keep rebuilding your cage with smarter tools. It's time to look deeper. Because once you see how debt was wired into your beliefs, you can start unwiring it. Not by avoiding responsibility, but by reclaiming authorship. You didn't choose this story, but you can choose how it ends.
Debt doesn't just shape how you think, it shapes how others treat you. The moment you owe someone money, the power dynamic shifts. The rules change. You're no longer just a person, you're a liability, a risk profile, a walking contract with legs. And that's not paranoia, that's design. Debt, at its core, is a control mechanism disguised as a favor. The entire system works because you believe you're in charge, while quietly being conditioned to stay compliant. Ever notice how debt makes you more predictable? You show up to the same job, even if you hate it. You tolerate mistreatment because you need the paycheck. You avoid taking creative or financial risks, not because you lack ideas, but because the fear of missing a payment feels more dangerous than staying stuck. Debt manufacturers know this. That's why the system doesn't just lend money, it engineers your behavior. Let's break it down. Step 1. Get you emotionally hooked. They dangle security, approval, adulthood. You're approved feels like validation. You matter now. You belong. You're worthy of trust. Step 2. Normalize the contract. They bury the fine print in language that sounds neutral, like APR, terms, minimum due, rewards. But the real language is psychological. Delay, guilt, fear, obedience. Step 3. Train your nervous system. Your body learns to flinch at every bill. Your brain rewires to expect dread on the 15th or 30th. Late notices trigger shame, not resistance. You're not just repaying money, you're being molded. Molded into someone easier to manage, easier to manipulate, easier to monetize. You start to internalize the rules. Don't ask for too much. Stay grateful for what they give. Stay in your lane. Keep the payments coming. They don't need guards or bars. They have your compliance, your fear of rocking the boat, your hope that if you just keep your head down long enough, you'll eventually get out. Here's the brutal truth. Most debt is designed not to be paid off. It's designed to be serviced. Think about it. Why do credit card companies raise your limit when you're close to maxing out? Why do banks offer refinancing options that sound generous but stretch the loan longer? Why are payday loans legal despite having interest rates that would make a loan shark blush? Because your servitude is more valuable than your success. A borrower who pays off their debt is a short-term profit. A borrower who stays just behind but never defaults is a gold mine. This is where it gets darker. The debt system is perfectly aligned with behavioral psychology. They study how people respond to fear, urgency, and shame. They know how to pace your panic just enough to keep you engaged, but not so much that you give up completely. One study showed that people are more likely to keep paying a loan they emotionally regret than one they rationally understand. Translation: they exploit your guilt, not your logic. Let's put it another way. You don't stay in debt because of poor math. You stay in debt because of emotional manipulation. Take minimum payments. They sound manageable, responsible, but they're a trap. Paying the minimum on most credit cards ensures you stay in debt for years, even decades, while paying 2 to 5 times the original amount. But that's the trick. It feels like progress, like you're doing your part, like you're playing by the rules. And as long as you believe that, the system keeps winning. Here's where the identity part kicks in. Debt quietly convinces you that your job is to maintain the system, not challenge it. Ever wonder why people with crushing debt still get marketed new credit lines? Why subprime borrowers are offered car loans they can't afford? Because once you're trained to live in cycles of desperation and short-term relief, you're easier to control. You start to live in survival mode. And survival mode doesn't ask big questions. It doesn't start revolutions. It doesn't dream big. It stays small, obedient, reactive. That's exactly where they want you. Debt becomes the leash that limits your motion. You can run in circles. You can hustle. You can post motivational quotes and read finance books and work weekends. But you'll never stray too far because the leash is tight and the handler knows how to yank it when you start to wander. And yes, there's a racial and class component to this too. Debt has always been used as a tool to discipline the poor and domesticate the ambitious. Redlining, predatory student loans, bankruptcy laws designed to favor the rich. Entire communities are targeted for loans that create dependence, not mobility. It's not about giving people access, it's about putting them in check. And here's the hardest part to accept. Sometimes the people closest to you become debt's enforcers. Parents who say, just be grateful you got approved. Friends who brag about high credit scores but never ask if you're happy. Bosses who dangle job security like it's salvation. They're not evil. They're just plugged in, running the script they were handed, policing the same system that keeps them scared. But you don't have to stay in it. Once you realize that debt is a psychological script, not just a financial situation, you can start to rewrite it. That doesn't mean ignoring your bills. It means recognizing when the fear is no longer yours, just something you absorbed. It means noticing when your choices are based on obligation, not opportunity. It means refusing to confuse obedience with stability. So next time you feel that familiar anxiety rise up, the email from your bank, the call from the collector, the moment your card gets declined, pause. Ask yourself, whose story am I living? Whose system am I protecting? And what would I choose if I weren't afraid of owing anyone anything, not even their approval?
Because that's where the power begins to shift. Not when the debt disappears, but when the spell breaks. Let's talk about who you become when you owe. Not your bank balance, not your job title, not your LinkedIn bio. Who you are.
When every month, part of your paycheck is already spoken for. When your life is forward leased to people you've never met, bound by interest rates you didn't fully understand, and measured by a score you didn't create. Debt doesn't just change your finances, it changes your self-concept. It rewires your identity. Here's how you know it's already happening. You hesitate to ask for a raise, not because you don't deserve it, but because something in you whispers, be grateful you even have this job. You stop seeing money as a tool and start seeing it as a gatekeeper. You begin to think of financial freedom as something reserved for those kinds of people, disciplined, lucky, smarter. Eventually, the number in your account starts to feel like the number that defines you. This is the first trick debt pulls. It shrinks your sense of self. Not all at once, slowly. You stop dreaming big. You stop applying to things that feel too ambitious. You settle into routines that feel safe, responsible, normal. Because once you owe, you start to play defense. You make choices based on what might go wrong, not what could go right. Your future becomes less about potential and more about protection. This creates an identity loop. The more you owe, the more you see yourself as someone who must be careful. And the more careful you become, the smaller your sense of possibility shrinks. You start to identify as a person in debt. You start using phrases like, I just want to get back to zero. I'm bad with money. I can't afford to think about that right now. Once I pay this off, I'll finally be free. These aren't just statements. They're psychological contracts. You're unconsciously promising yourself that your life can't start until the debt ends. But that's a lie, because by the time the debt ends, the mindset usually hasn't. Even people who pay it all off often carry the fear and shame for years. They save obsessively. They undercharge for their work. They panic over small purchases. They're debt-free on paper, but still mentally imprisoned. That's the second trick debt pulls. It hijacks your emotional baseline. You become used to a low-grade anxiety humming under every decision. You calculate everything before doing it. You second-guess every financial move. You flinch at unknown numbers, avoid opening mail, delay checking your bank app. It's not the debt anymore. It's the anticipation of loss. The feeling that life is one missed payment away from unraveling. This is what psychologists call learned helplessness. When you've been hit enough times, you stop resisting, even when the door's unlocked.
Debt conditions you to believe that struggle is permanent and that your job is to manage it, not question it. And let's not ignore the relational damage it causes. Debt isolates you. You start avoiding friends who want to go out. You lie about why you can't travel. You nod along in financial conversations, pretending you're okay while secretly drowning. You stop seeing yourself as someone worthy of generosity, luxury, fun, joy. You feel like you have to earn back your dignity one payment at a time. And worst of all, you become emotionally numb to your own desires. You start telling yourself things like, I don't need much. I just want peace. I'm fine staying where I am. But those aren't dreams. They're defensive compromises. They're what happens when identity fuses with debt and decides that desire is dangerous. This numbness becomes part of your personality. You call it maturity. You call it being realistic. But deep down, you know it's grief. Because the part of you that once dreamed without limits now lives in a cage of caution. And here's the haunting part. You didn't become less capable. You became less willing, less emotionally available to your own potential, less trusting of your ability to thrive without a backup plan, less willing to risk looking greedy, indulgent, or irresponsible. This is what debt steals, not just your freedom, but your permission to want, to try, to stretch, to believe. And the longer you stay in that state, the more it hardens. Until one day, you wake up and realize you're not just paying down a loan, you're living a life built around avoidance. Avoiding risk, avoiding rejection, avoiding that terrifying question, what do I actually want if I'm not trying to escape? Because here's the truth. Most people don't dream about wealth. They dream about not being scared anymore. But fear-based freedom isn't freedom. It's just a quieter form of control. So let's ask the hard question. Who would you be if you didn't owe anyone anything? Not money, not validation, not approval. Can you even imagine that person? Can you picture yourself walking into a room not needing to prove anything? Not calculating every step? Not waiting for the next financial blow? Or does that image feel too distant, maybe even uncomfortable? If so, that's the work. Because here's the final trick debt pulls. It makes you believe that safety comes from external systems, credit scores, job titles, emergency funds, when in reality, true security starts internally. It's not just about money, it's about ownership, not of things, of your identity, of your voice, of your choices. That's the only real repayment plan that matters. Reclaiming who you are when no one else gets to define your worth.
Let's talk about shame. Not the kind that teaches, the kind that silences. The kind of shame that sticks to debt like mold to walls. The kind that doesn't just say, you made a mistake, it says, you are the mistake. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Debt alone doesn't break people. Shame does. Because you can negotiate numbers, you can restructure payments, you can hustle, downsize, sell things, rebuild. But once shame sets in, it starts rewriting who you think you are. And that's by design. Society doesn't just discourage debt, it weaponizes it. You've heard the stories. If you're in debt, you must have lived above your means. You probably bought dumb stuff. You didn't work hard enough. You just need to be more disciplined. The implication is always the same. It's your fault. But let's step back for a second. You live in a culture where tuition costs more than a house, where healthcare can bankrupt you overnight, where wages haven't matched inflation in decades, yet somehow if you owe money, you are the irresponsible one? That's not logic, that's gaslighting. And it runs deep. Shame doesn't just hurt, it controls. It makes people quiet. It makes them lie to friends. It makes them avoid help. It makes them perform normalcy while breaking inside. It turns debt from a math problem into a moral stain. And the system loves that. Because a shamed person is easy to manage. They don't complain. They don't organize. They don't ask big questions. They turn the anger inward. Let's be clear. The shame isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. Because once you feel like your debt is a reflection of your character, you stop focusing on the structure and start obsessing over your flaws. That's how oppression maintains itself without having to enforce rules from the outside. It installs them inside your psyche. So now every time you spend, even on necessities, you feel guilty. Every time you take a break from work, you feel lazy. Every time you think about a dream, you feel unworthy. That's the trap. Shame doesn't make you wiser, it makes you smaller. And it's not just individual, it's cultural. Certain communities, especially those historically marginalized, have been systematically over-targeted by predatory lending. Then, once buried in debt, they're told they're financially illiterate or bad with money. That's not a coincidence. That's economic racism wearing a customer service smile. Let's take student loans. The average young adult is told, go to college, it's the only way out. Don't worry about the cost, you'll figure it out later. Just take out the loan. Everyone does it. And then, a decade later, they're drowning in interest, being told they should have known better. That's not education, that's entrapment. And the shame that follows? That's part of the design. Because if you're busy blaming yourself, you're too distracted to ask, why was I offered a lifetime of debt before I even had a full-time job? Why does our system reward lenders for bad bets but punish borrowers forever? Why are some debts, like gambling losses or corporate bankruptcies, forgiven instantly while others haunt people for decades? Shame doesn't want you to ask those questions, because shame needs you to stay grateful for crumbs, to believe that being allowed to borrow was a privilege, not a setup, to think that paying your minimums makes you a good person. It wants you docile, tired, ashamed. And here's where it gets even sicker. Shame around debt is often performative. People perform financial success online, cars, clothes, luxury trips, not because they're thriving, but because they're hiding. People perform frugality, saving hacks, budget spreadsheets, not because they feel free, but because they need to feel in control of the chaos. It's all part of the same cycle. Debt, shame, pretend, repeat. And the worst part? We judge each other for symptoms of a disease that's systemic. We look down on the person who filed for bankruptcy, but not the credit card company that sold them a 28% interest rate. We criticize someone for driving Uber at night, but not the university that sold them a worthless $80,000 degree. We mock people on food stamps, but not the housing market that locked them out of ownership. Why? Because it's easier to feel superior than to feel connected. It's easier to believe you're better with money than to accept that the game is rigged and anyone could be next. Shame keeps us divided, and divided people don't revolt. So how do you break it? Not with numbers, with honesty. You stop hiding. You stop pretending. You speak the unspeakable truth. Yes, I'm in debt. No, it doesn't define me. Yes, I've made mistakes, but that doesn't make me a mistake. Yes, I want more, not because I'm greedy, but because I'm tired of surviving. You start surrounding yourself with people who aren't just financially savvy, but emotionally awake. People who know that self-worth isn't measured in savings. People who know that discipline without compassion is just punishment. People who refuse to perpetuate the myth that debt equals failure. Because the only real failure is staying stuck in a story someone else wrote for you. So ask yourself, who benefits from your shame? Who profits when you stay quiet? And what becomes possible when you finally stop apologizing for wanting a different ending? Because that's where things shift. Not when the debt disappears, but when the shame does.
Here's the lie you've been sold. That freedom from debt comes from more discipline, more spreadsheets, more grinding, more control. And if you just try hard enough, stay organized, skip the lattes, and budget every dollar down to the decimal, you'll eventually climb out. But let's stop pretending. Most get-out-of-debt advice isn't freedom, it's a better cage. You're told to track every purchase like a criminal on probation, to downgrade your life until it's responsible, to delay joy until you're financially stable. You're not being freed. You're being trained to think like a debtor forever, even when the balance hits zero. Let's be brutally honest here.
The system doesn't want you debt-free. It wants you disciplined enough to keep paying and shamed enough to never question the terms. So instead of rebellion, you get routines. Instead of empowerment, you get apps. Instead of clarity, you get hustle culture rebranded as financial literacy. And the kicker? It all feels productive. You start thinking, if I just stick to this plan for the next 5 years, if I pick up a side hustle and cut everything extra, if I max out my 401k and never eat out again, then maybe you'll feel safe. But let's call it what it is. Survival with a positive spin. And here's the twist. Even if you make it out, if you finally become debt-free, you may still feel trapped. Why? Because the mindset never changed. The world didn't magically become less predatory. You just learned how to dodge the bullets better. You still flinch when your phone rings. You still get anxious when an unexpected charge hits. You still feel like everything you built could crumble with one emergency. That's not freedom. That's trauma management. Let's take an example. A woman in her 30s spends years digging out of 6 figures in student loan debt. She works weekends, never travels, lives on rice and canned beans, and finally, after a decade, she's free. But now, she hoards money. She panics when her car makes a weird noise. She avoids going to the doctor, even with insurance. She says no to everything that costs more than $20. Not because she has to, but because she still lives like someone who's afraid to fall behind. Why? Because her identity was built on debt survival, not wealth creation. She escaped the number, but not the mentality. That's the illusion. You think you're climbing toward freedom, but often you're just upgrading the walls of your cage. You go from one kind of debt, financial, to another kind, emotional, existential. Always alert, always calculating, always waiting for something to go wrong. So what's the way out? Not more control, not more tools, not more punishment disguised as prudence. The real exit begins with this. Refuse to think like a debtor. That doesn't mean ignoring your finances. It means rejecting the psychological posture that says, I am at the mercy of systems. My value is measured in how well I avoid mistakes. If I just behave well enough, I'll be allowed to relax. Because let's be honest, most people don't want to be rich. They want to be unchained. They want to stop feeling like every decision is a test. They want to stop seeing themselves as a problem to fix. They want to stop planning their lives around damage control. But here's what no financial guru will tell you. You can't budget your way out of a belief system. You can't save your way out of a scarcity identity. You can't hustle your way out of a story where you're always the one with less. You have to exit the frame entirely. And that starts with asking one uncomfortable question. What would I do if I wasn't trying to escape anymore? Not what you would buy, not what you would fix. What would you build? Who would you become? Because real financial power doesn't start with a higher income or a lower interest rate. It starts with seeing the system for what it is and choosing to stop playing the role it cast you in. It starts with walking into a room and knowing you are no longer collateral. You are no longer a line item. You are not defined by what you owe or what you've paid off. You are not the debt. You are the decider. And when you internalize that, when your nervous system catches up to the truth that you are no longer surviving but choosing, that's when freedom begins. Not when the last payment clears, but when the identity of the debtor dies.
You've probably heard the phrase, pay yourself first. But what if that doesn't just mean setting aside savings? What if it means mentally shifting who you believe you are in the system? Because right now, you think like someone asking for money, hoping to be approved, living life in permission mode. That's not financial literacy. That's financial submission. To truly reclaim your power, You need to think like the lender, not the borrower. Not in the capitalist sense of owning everything and exploiting others, but in the existential sense, the one who creates, not chases, the one who makes the rules, not follows them, the one who defines value, not waits to be assigned it. Here's the real truth. The most dangerous thing debt takes from you isn't money, it's mental sovereignty. It convinces you you're only as valuable as your income, your productivity, your credit score. But your real credit, the only one that matters, is internal. It's how much you trust yourself to walk away from shame, how much you believe in your ability to rebuild without asking permission, how confidently you move through the world without being owned by banks, by systems, by false narratives of worth. This isn't just about debt freedom. It's about identity repossession. You are not a debtor trying to escape. You are a human reclaiming authorship. And that changes everything. Because once you stop thinking like you owe anyone, you start acting like someone who owns themselves.